They're traveling with him. I believe we met at a Bangor Christian event. He used to be headmaster there. By the way, he was not headmaster when I was a student there. He was nowhere near old enough, but I am thankful for the 2 years I spent there. It changed my life. I was a troubled child. I spent a lot of time at the assistant principal for discipline at Bucksport High. I never let homework interfere with my education. I did just enough to play sports, and I did all my study hall I did all my homework in study hall when I was talking with my friends. So I was a real scholar. And I got straightened out, and I got assurance of my salvation when I was about 18. And the Lord called me to serve Him. And so Bangor Christian has made all the difference. So we appreciate the school, and we appreciate Brother Benjamin. And he's got to come and minister. He's a man that understands a lot about trees. He's a doctor, but he won't do you any good, okay? So unless you have a sick tree, he probably will not be able to help you. But he's pretty good on rings and trees, but he's going to minister through the Bible and science, and God's a God of science, amen? So we appreciate him coming. But before he comes, we have some friends of ours, actually probably friends of Brenda's, and I was their pastor for about 9 years, and they're still recovering. It's been quite a few years now. They are from the deep south. They're from Lexington, South Carolina, Kathy and Frankie Townsend, and they're going to come and minister musically. And then Dr. Benjamin can come. Amen?
everyone. Good to see you all. Just got to grab that connector. Just give us 1 second. Let me know when it's up. There we go. Okay, very good. Phew. We tried it earlier this morning, but you never know when it's time. All right. Well, thank you for the invitation, Tony, Pastor Muniz. As he said, we met at a BCS event, somehow connected, and my daughter and I, my oldest daughter and I, ran a marathon when he was in Lubec, and we connected a little bit more at that point in time. And every once in a while, he drops into Bangor, and we have coffee, and probably the last time, maybe it was 2 times ago, I said, I haven't told you, I'm not at the school anymore, and I'm also working part-time for an organization called Creation Ministries. He goes, I hadn't heard that. So I sent him some information, and anyway, this was probably a year and a half, kind of 2 years in the making for us to connect and have an opportunity, so I really am grateful for the opportunity to be here. As you can see, the title of this main message is Connecting Creation to the Gospel. It all starts in Genesis. That's what the name means. And what we're going to do this morning is start by asking a few questions. All right? Show of hands. Do you want to grow in your faith? Yeah? Do you want your children and your grandchildren to be followers of Christ when they become adults? Yeah? I can already tell this is going to be fun because you guys are actually participating. I don't know how often you go to other churches, but sometimes it's just eyes straight ahead, nobody says anything, nobody moves, nobody laughs. This will be good. I knew that was going to be the answer because it was a beautiful fall day and you guys are still here, right? So we all want those things, and I want them as well. And that's why what we're going to do, and what I invite you to do, is put Mark 12:30 into practice. We're all familiar with this verse. Love God with your whole being, heart, soul, mind, and strength. But sometimes, I think, folks outside the church feel that we need to kind of check our brain at the door when we walk in. But engaging your mind is a form of worship. Asking questions, seeking answers to them is a form of worship, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to ask and answer questions that are fundamental to our faith. So again, show of hands. How many of you have heard questions like these? Either you've asked them of somebody or someone's asked them of you. Did dinosaurs and humans exist at the same time? How did all the animals fit on the ark? Did God use evolution to create the world and us? Did he literally do everything in 6 days? Maybe it's a simple question like, how are fossils made? And although I probably doubt most of you have asked this last question, are the trees alive today that predate the flood? For those that are interested in forestry, not really an uncommon question in that way. How many of you have heard questions like these at some point in time? So look, keep your hands up and then look around. Everybody's got a hand up, right? It's because these are very common questions, and there's many, many, many more. At CMI, our goal is to provide you with credible answers that affirm the Bible with particular emphasis on Genesis. That's what we do. But I can't answer all of those questions or all the questions you may have in just a half an hour, 40-minute talk. So what we want to do, we're an information ministry, we want to get the information to you. Yeah, we do have some books in the back, but there's really an easy place to get a lot of answers. Where do you go when you have a question these days? Just yell it out. Google. Okay, I don't want you to Google the answer to these questions, but that is where we go. We go to the internet. I want you to go to creation.com for those questions that you have in this regard. You're going to get a biblically sound answer for all of those questions. So if something that you hear on the news this week doesn't quite line up with what you know your pastor has been teaching or what you know to be true in the Bible, go to creation.com, type that topic or type that question in the search bar at the top, and chances are one of the more than 14,000 articles, videos will already have addressed it in many different ways. It's possible that you have a question that we haven't thought of or we haven't been asked before. And I would just invite you to send that as an email to CMI, and one of the researchers on staff will take it upon themselves to provide you an answer, and it might even turn into a magazine article or a book at some point in time. We've got, I think the head office is in, well, I know the head office is in Georgia, but we've got about 6 or 7 full-time speakers. And every Sunday, a group of us are out all across the country doing this. And at the end of the year, at least it was pre-COVID, we're getting back to normal, but pre-COVID it was about 300 presentations a year. I've been doing this for about 2 years now. And the reason we do it is because your children and grandchildren, coworkers, family members, friends, are going to ask you questions about this topic. It will happen, and you need to be prepared. It might go something like this. What'd you learn at school today, son? Oh, it was really interesting, Dad. We learned that humans evolved from ape-like creatures millions of years ago. Isn't that amazing? Now, the dad in the cartoon has the deer in the headlights look. Like, what do I say to that? How do I answer that? It's kind of funny, and we can sort of joke and laugh that, oh, he should know. He's gone to church his whole life. He should know what the answer is. But if you put yourself in that place right now, how would you answer it? When someone asks a question, that's the time they're ready for an answer. And we have to be prepared to give them one. Doesn't mean you have to have a PhD in every one of these disciplines in order to give an answer, but you need to either be able to direct them to a place that they can find an answer, or give them some basic answer to help them. So the reason that we need to be prepared is biblical. 1 Peter 3:15. We need to be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. Another version says, with gentleness and respect. Although that verse is not explicitly talking about being prepared to give answers to creation questions, it's all part of it, because the first part of the verse talks about revering Christ as Lord. And as those songs that we just sang mention, he created it all. So we need to be prepared in this way. But I do want to highlight the meekness and fear, the gentleness and respect. It does no good if it ends up being an argument between people. So we need to gently and respectfully point them in the right direction. Not get defensive, but have an answer that we can provide. So I've already mentioned the website. What was that? Creation.com. You guys are really good. Creation.com. Another way that you can get regular information coming into your inbox, your email inbox, is to sign up for our newsletter. So where did Bob go? Here we go. He's going to pass out a couple of sign-up sheets that you can sign up for our free email newsletter. Now, we're not going to sell your information. We're not going to spam your inbox. This is just a place where if you give us your name, email address, and zip code, every couple of weeks, you'll get a professionally done email with links to 3, 4, 5 different articles that can help answer questions that you may have as it relates to this topic. Now, your name and email address is obvious. We ask for a zip code because when we visit an area, we send an email out to the surrounding areas to say, hey, there's someone from Creation Ministries coming, you might be interested in that. And I don't know, maybe someone in here has received that from other talks that have been done. But that's what we're looking for. So as those sheets are being passed around, let me share some of the information that might come in one of those info bite emails. So here's a school of fish that was fossilized in real time. Now, what would it take to simultaneously fossilize 257 fish, all swimming in formation at the same time? Does that sound like something that would happen slowly over thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, or probably something rapidly? Does anybody know of an event in the Bible where there was a lot of water over a relatively short amount of time that would have caused a huge amount of sedimentation? Noah's flood. The flood answers a lot of questions that we see in the fossil record and in geology. That's not what you're going to get for an answer if you go to Google. But as we'll show today, or as I hope I will show today, there's some plausible, legitimate reasons to be thinking that way. Now here's another one. It's not always a detailed scientific creation evolution type question. How many of you have spoken and thought more about your immune system more in the last 2 or 3 years than you ever have in your life? We've talked about it. The pandemic has changed the way we think about things, the way we do things. But your immune system couldn't have evolved. Right? It's a design, it's a gift from God. And so when there's culturally relevant as well as scientifically relevant topics, CMI takes a hold of those and puts the information out so you can have it. One that we're going to be looking at least in at some level of detail today, is did God create over millions of years? And does that even matter? That's really the whole point of this talk. Because some view in church that it really doesn't matter. Genesis isn't that important, and we can insert millions of years into those days, and everything is fine. But I'm going to show that it's not a biblical approach to looking at that. So that's what the info bite is. So when that sign-up sheet comes by, if you'd like to, give your name and email, and we'll get that out to you soon. So let's go back to this situation. What happens, 10 years from now with this child? What does he turn into? What's the next stage of life? Teenager, adolescent. So what's happening to our teens? Well, across the country, teens are walking away from their faith. Now, you can look at a variety of different statistics, and you might get half, you might get 80%. On one hand, it really doesn't matter what the number is. Many intend to walk away when they leave home. That's their intention. Mom and dad make them come to church, but they're planning on leaving. They say the church had no answers. I believe in science, not the Bible. Unfortunately, they're also successful in their intent. They walk away. Christianity is irrelevant. It's uninspiring. It was just a phase I had to go through when I was growing up. And I don't want this to happen to my kids. Our oldest just got married last summer, and I have twins that are in the back that are helping out today. I don't want it to happen to your children either. We hear about this issue every week we go out on ministry. As I said, 300 presentations a year. This is a common thing. And so that's why a few years ago, CMI produced a DVD documentary called Fallout. And it's where we visited college campuses, and we just randomly asked students that were walking by 4 very simple, basic questions. Did you grow up in church? Do you believe in evolution or creation? Has your church ever taught you how science fits with the Bible? And lastly, do you still attend church? And the results are pretty interesting. If we let the students go by that said, no, I wasn't raised in church. We were interested in talking to those that said, yes, I was raised in church. We said, okay, if you were raised in church, do you believe in creation or evolution? The ones that said, I believe in evolution, none of them had ever heard growing up how science fits with the Bible, and only one still faithfully attended church. Okay, so flip that around. Yes, I grew up in church. Yes, I believe in creation. All of the ones that said that learned how science fits with the Bible growing up, and they still faithfully attend church. Now, it's an anecdotal study, but the take-home message is families that are raising their children talking about this issue, teaching about this issue, are raising kids that are stronger in their faith. Now, how can you deal with this? Well, first, you have to kind of reconcile in your heads that you have to give an alternative answer to the questions they're asking. You have to give them something different than what they're finding on Google. You also have to recognize it's going to take an understanding of science and some science topics in order to do this, but I don't want you to panic with that. If science wasn't your thing in school, the rest of this talk is designed to give you a few key concepts that you can apply to do just that, to give an alternative answer. So the first thing to kind of reconcile our brains with is the difference between operational science and historical science. So operational science occurs in the present. It's observable, repeatable, and testable. This is the science that you learned in school, where you make an observation about the world around you, form a hypothesis to explain that observation, design an experiment to test it, conduct that experiment, collect the data, analyze it, write the report, and the process repeats itself, so things get refined. That's operational science. It's given us tremendous medical advances in the last 100 years. It's put men on the moon. It's given you cell phones that are probably vibrating in your pocket right now. But that's operational, and we're pro-operational. but it's important to understand the distinction with historical science. And creation and evolution fall into this category. They don't happen in the present by the nature of the name we apply to it. They're not observable, they're not repeatable, and they're not testable. So this morning, when I say the word evolution, I'm referring to the account of our origins from molecules to man over long periods of time. When I say creation, I'm also talking about the account of our origins, but it's the biblical account as plainly written in Genesis, taken literally. It's the biblical interpretation of our origins. And as I said, both of these are examples of historical science. And to effectively talk to your children, grandchildren, family, friends, coworkers about this issue, you really have to have a good, solid understanding of what this means when you have these conversations. The best way I can describe it is to talk about the evidence. So can you see what these two men in the cartoon are fighting over? Someone just yell it out. A fossil. Someone said it. They're fighting over a fossil. Now, does the fossil exist in the past or the present? See, it's always a different answer with that. And I'm not trying to trick you, but the fossil exists in the present. Now, it's a cartoon, I get it. But if I had a fossil with me, it exists right now. But we make interpretations about the past based on the evidence we have in front of us. Now, who has the most evidence in that cartoon? Is it the creationist or the evolutionist? It's the same. They have the same evidence. Well, maybe it's the biologist or the geologist or the astronomer. They all have the same evidence, but they make different interpretations, and that's the key with historical science. I like to also think of this, and I keep going back to the point or the distinction between historical and operational science. I like to think of it in terms of two lawyers battling it out in a courtroom. Does anybody recognize that guy? Right? I grew up in the 80s, and I love this show. It's Matlock, right? Andy Griffith. I wanted to be a lawyer for many years because of this show. I'd watch it, and 5 minutes left in the show every single week. What happened? The prosecutor stands up and says, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence that I've presented to you clearly shows that the defendant is guilty. You must find him guilty of all charges." And then Matlock stands up, his rumpled suit and southern drawl, which I can't mimic, but he says the exact opposite. "No, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client is innocent. The evidence that we've presented before you clearly shows that he's innocent. You must acquit him or her of all charges." And what happened? Every single week. Who won? Matlock won. I wanted to be Matlock. I want to win. The truth was always on his side week after week. As Christians, we have to remember that the truth is always on our side week after week too, day after day. And where do we go for the truth about our origins, for the truth about creation? We got back to the Bible. And where do we go in the Bible? We go to Genesis. That is also correct. But a lot of people, and I'll be honest, even in churches, say, there's many ways to interpret it. It's just a side issue, and it's not really relevant anyway. But Genesis does matter. It matters to you and your family. Because I just showed you results from a documentary where a bunch of teens are walking away from their faith because they didn't have a proper understanding of Genesis. Genesis can't be removed from the Bible. It might seem like a weird thing to say in church, but what I mean is we can't pick and choose what we want to believe and what we don't want to believe, or what we want to accept or not accept in the Bible. This is an ugly slide, and I recognize that. On the top, from left to right, are the 66 books of the Bible, Genesis through to Revelation, and on the bottom, it's the same thing. What I hope you can see are a whole bunch of red lines and blue lines. Does that come clear? Okay, the blue lines represent cross-references in the Bible from books of the Old Testament to other books of the Bible, New and Old. And the red lines represent cross-references from books of the New Testament back to other parts of the Bible, New and Old. And there's over 2,800 different cross-references in the Bible. So that means it's intricately connected. And that's what I mean when I say I can't pick and choose the stuff I don't want to believe. If it's in there, I've got to accept it. I don't have to like it, but I need to accept it. And I hope I'm not the only one in here that would admit there's a lot of stuff I don't like. I wish wasn't there. My life might be easier for a time if that wasn't there. But that's not the case. And with Genesis in particular, there's over 100 different cross-references to Genesis in the New Testament. 60 of those references are to the first 11 chapters, and Jesus himself referred to those first 11 chapters 16 different times in his ministry. I don't know how many times it would have to be for it to be relevant to me, probably just one, but it's important to understand that it's not something we can just ignore. I'm a skeptic by nature. Pastor Muniz indicated he became a Christian at 18 when probably in part because of Bangor Christian. I was late 20s and I was a very slow drag into this, asking lots of questions and kind of skeptical by nature. And so I flipped this question around and say, well, what if I don't take Genesis literally? What's the big deal? Well, if it's not real literal history with a literal very good creation and a literal Adam and Eve, then sin didn't literally enter the world through their actions, and you and I don't literally need to be saved from anything. That's really the fundamental point when it comes to Genesis and the connection of creation to the gospel. Because Genesis answers three of the most important questions that anybody would ever ask themselves. And everybody in here, even the little kids that were here, probably have asked themselves these questions, maybe not in this order, and maybe not in the exact wording. But the three questions are, where did I come from? What's my purpose in life? And what happens when I die? We've all asked those questions. And interestingly, how you answer the last two depends on how you answer the first one. Where did I come from? So ultimately, this is a worldview issue. It's a worldview question or concept. So if we look at the biblical timeline, if we look at the two competing worldviews, biblically speaking, we have creation roughly 6,000 years ago, Noah's flood roughly 4,500 years ago, and Jesus about 2,000 years ago. We're familiar with that. The biblical timeline, the biblical view puts humans at the very beginning, day 6. We get that timeline from going back to the Bible. And all those places where it lists the genealogies, and then there's lifespans, and they were this old when this child was born. I admit, when I first was reading the Bible, I skipped over that. I can't pronounce the names, and I moved on. But it's important, because if you connect those dots all the way back using what's called a chronogenealogy, you can develop the biblical timeline. That's where we get that age. On the flip side, or contrary to that, is the evolutionary worldview, and the scale is completely different. Evolutionary worldview has, the Big Bang occurring roughly 14 billion years ago, Earth 4.5 billion years ago, first life 3 billion years ago, and it puts humans near the end of that. So at the very least, no matter what anybody in here thinks of which view they hold, we all have to admit that both of those can't be right at the same time. That is an easy one for us to agree on. They can't both be right. So where does truth come from? If we want to know what's true, where does truth come from? Well, if we look at the two views again, we'll take the evolutionary view. Well, it produces a tree of humanism rooted in evolution, and ultimately that's where man decides truth. That's where that came from. Christianity is rooted in creation, where God decides truth. And you can see the fruit that's produced from those two trees. And you know what's happening in our society right now. The tree of humanism has produced a lot of problems in our society. Well, I will pick and I would select fruit from the Christian tree, the tree of Christianity, any day over the other. Now, if God is our creator, we just sang about him this morning, and we are his creation, then he has the right to tell me, he has the right to tell us what's right and wrong. But if man is the production of random chance and millions of years and evolution, you can see what's produced from that view. So when you ask a question, do you want the right answer or the wrong one? We all want the right one. Now, when I was in school, Pastor Muna has indicated what he was like in school, I would have been that kid in the back just blurting out some sarcastic answer. So sometimes I would ask questions just kind of to be that annoying, trying to make a point. But generally speaking, when we legitimately ask a question, we want the right answer. We don't want someone to lie to us, okay? So what we're going to do for the rest of this particular talk, before we get into the break and and coffee time, I'm going to try to address at least, I wouldn't say a surface level, but a little bit deeper, 2 questions. Did God literally make the universe and everything in it in 6 days? And then how are fossils made? So we're going to apply what we've learned about operational and historical science. We're going to apply what we know to be true from a biblical worldview. We're going to look at those 2 questions from that. So did God literally make the universe and everything in it in 6 days? Where basically the hypothesis is, did God create the heavens and the earth on day 1? Did he separate the waters and make the expanse on day 2? Cause dry land to appear on day 3? Sun, the moon, and the stars on day 4? Birds of the air, fish of the sea on day 5? And lastly, land creatures, including us. Did he do that? Well, I would say yes as well, but I've also come across people that would say no. No, each day represents millions of years in that account that I just read. And sometimes they use a verse like 2 Peter to highlight that one day with the Lord as 1,000 years. One day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. How many of you have heard that verse? It doesn't have anything to do with creation. It's talking about God's patience and long-suffering, because he doesn't want anyone to perish. It's talking about the coming of his Messiah. When is that going to happen? And it's like, well, we don't know. We can't use our time frame for that. This verse has nothing to do with creation. What's important is to also look back to other times and places in the Bible where the word day is used, and how do we interpret that? A very obvious one would be Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. Very plainly written. It doesn't say 6 days and each day equals. It says in 6 days. So the question is, did he literally do this in 6? Well, the key thing about interpreting that biblically is looking at Genesis chapter 1. Verses 5, 8, 13, 19, 23, and 31 all have a really key phrase. There's evening and morning, and then it lists the day. First day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, and sixth day. We're challenging the use, or some people challenge the use of the word day in this context, in Genesis chapter 1. But every other time in the Bible where it's used in the same way, we never question it. In fact, 523 other times in the Bible, the word day is used in the same way that it is in Genesis chapter 1, and nobody questions that it's a regular 24-hour day. So my question to those that would bring that forward as an argument for it has to be long time is, well, why would we do that? That doesn't make sense. We don't question the other times. But what is a legitimate question is, well, where did those long time periods come from that I learned about in school, or that I see on the internet, or that I've seen when I go to places like the Grand Canyon? Where do the long time periods from geology come from? That's what I was taught at school. If Genesis is true, it's 6 literal days, then we have to reconcile in some way what we see in places like the Grand Canyon. I'm going to go into some detail on rock formation, canyon formation, radiometric dating in a few minutes, but I'm going to give you the answer to the question first, just in case the smells from the break room are kind of making you dozy. I'll give you the answer, and then I'll give you the detail, and then we'll review the answer. So the answer is, layers of rock and canyons don't require a long period of time to form, and I'll give you an example, a case study. And rock ages have absolutely been misinterpreted using radiometric dating techniques. And I'll give you an example from a case study. And that case study is going to be Mount St. Helens. May 18th, 1980, an earthquake caused the north side of the mountain to slide away. It caused an eruption of steam and gas that exploded northward towards Spirit Lake, and it erupted for 9 hours on that afternoon. it's important, think back to our operational and historical science. Yes, that happened in the past, but it was observed. We know what happened, okay? It happened in a lot of our lifetime. So let's look at what happened afterwards. It changed the landscape there forever. And we're going to look at 3 distinct sections of the resulting topography. The first, I think it's about 22 feet of finely layered sediment was laid down. Basically, it's ash. From the initial eruption, a layer of ash fell down. Makes sense from a volcano. About a month later, there was actually a second eruption. And you can see, I think this is the one that's the 22 feet, you can see finely layered sediment all the way through there, right? And if I hadn't told you, if you didn't know and believe me that that happened in one afternoon, in fact, this one was 3 hours, June 12th, 1980, only lasted 3 hours, would have easily thought it was thousands of years for each one. We zoom in, you can see all of these finely layered sections. And the top one was laid down in a mud flow a couple of years later, when a mud flow ripped through the valley. So if one, I'll say quote, in quotation marks, one little volcano could do this much destruction and damage in a matter of hours, imagine what would happen with a global flood and all the seismic activity that's been associated with that major event. It's hard to imagine, but it might help you look at geology a little bit differently now and interpret things from a geological and biblical perspective. Now, when it comes to canyon formation, I was taught in school that the Colorado River carved down through that rock a little bit of water over a long period of time. That's what I was taught. We're going to look at, again, back at Mount St. Helens, that mud flow that I talked about ripped through this valley, and it caused or created what has been coined the Little Grand Canyon. It's about a 40th the size. In one case, the canyon walls are 140 feet tall. It carved through that in a matter of hours, right? A single day, 40 miles an hour. A lot of water over a little bit of time, not the other way around. So rock layers don't require long periods of time to form. We don't have to have it. Canyons can be formed in a matter of hours or a single day. A lot of water in a short period of time. Now, the other one that I want to highlight is radiometric dating. You may have read articles or heard things that give millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, when a rock sample is sent to a laboratory for testing. Well, it doesn't come back with a date. There's data that has to be interpreted for that. And again, we'll go back to the Mount St. Helens and look at a rock that formed shortly after the eruption, within 10 years. So a lava plug formed at the top. The researchers took a sample of that rock, sent it for radiometric dating, and the whole rock came back with an age of 350,000 years. And the mineral components gave ranges in age from 340 all the way to 2.8 million years. But we know when the rock formed. It was less than 10 years old. So the question that we need to ask is, if we can't trust the radiometric age for a rock of known age, how can we trust the age when we're not sure how old the rock was? And there's all kinds of examples of this. If you go to creation.com and type radiometric dating, you'll get a lot of reports and studies and examples that cover the exact same thing. So what I'm hoping that I've done is at least planted some questions in your mind about, well, I didn't learn that in school, or I didn't know that. There's a lot of other areas that you can dig into to research that. But it could also be a simple question of, how are fossils made? If you go back to, and we think of the layers of sediment, how many of you heard growing up that it takes thousands of years, millions of years for fossils to form? I was taught that. That was the model I was given. It was something like this. A marine animal dies, sinks to the bottom of a water body. Over long periods of time, it is slowly buried. And then the process of mineralization takes place. Eventually, some other event occurs, it's discovered, and you've got long periods of time for that one organism, that one fossil. What's wrong with that assumption, or what's wrong with that model? in order for the fossil to be formed, or for that organism to be buried that way, there really has to be a watery catastrophe that buries it quickly before scavengers come, before the bones are all dispersed, before it decays and rots. So think back to the infobite that I showed at the beginning. A school of swimming fish fossilized in real time. It requires, it's an easier assumption to make to say that it needs a watery catastrophe, a lot of sedimentation over a shorter amount of time. I don't have an example of this happening in real time, but a cartoon works very well. You've got a happy smiling fish, then you got a scared fish, you got dead fish next, and then the happy fossilized fish once again. But we have actual evidence in fossils for things that would require a short amount of time to occur. This is a fossil of an ichthyosaur, and there's a tremendous amount of detail in this. So much detail that you can even see this is a fossil of an ichthyosaur giving birth. That's a long labor if it takes millions of years to happen. I took a long time to eat my dinner as a kid. Boiled potatoes, overcooked meat. This is a fossil of a fish eating a fish. Again, that would be a very slow meal if it took a long period of time to form. It's not going to stay in that state for thousands of years to get to the point where it's slowly buried. It just isn't going to happen. Now you might say, well, what about the fossilization process itself? That takes a long time. Well, what it takes is the right conditions. And we have examples of, this is an example of a felt hat that was buried in volcanic ash, and it took about 20 years for it to be fossilized. You could say that it evolved into a hard hat, but that's a different story. So what I've been trying to do is at least give you, we took some opening questions, and I gave you hopefully a couple things to think about. You can definitely find more information on the website, and there's some resources in the back as well in the other room. And as I said, my job this morning wasn't to answer all of your questions. It was to give you something to think about and point you to where you can get answers. First place was the creation.com, the website. The second, we passed around the sign-up sheet, and you can get the InfoBite newsletter in your inbox every other week. But when you look at these questions, I'm sure some of you are saying still, well, so what? Because that's what I'd be saying 20 years ago before I became a Christian. Like, well, whatever. Doesn't really help me. Why is this important? In order to answer why is it important, we have to go back to the Garden of Eden. The Bible describes a perfect paradise on day 6. What did God say at the end of his creation? He said it was very good. Right? Genesis 1:31. Very good. It was good every day. The 6th day, it was very good. And it was until death entered the world through sin. Let me ask you a question. And I heard through the prayer time a lot of requests for people being sick. Is being sick, disease, sin, death, suffering, are they very good things? No, they're not. We know that. But if your Garden of Eden rests on top of millions of years, then that means it's resting on millions of years of death, disease, and suffering. And God did not call that very good. So there's a biblical problem with that assumption, a theological one. He called this very good. And as I said, it was good. And then Adam messed it up for us. Right? God warned him, don't eat from that tree. For when you do, you will surely die. But Adam and Eve messed it up for us. And because of their sin, we've inherited their sin nature. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans chapter 5, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." And we know that. We know ourselves. We know what we're thinking. We know what we do. Anyone that's been around kids knows you have to teach them how to do the right thing. You don't have to teach them to disobey. We've inherited that. Fortunately, God designed a rescue mission at the beginning, featuring his Son. God's righteousness demands a penalty for sin, and that penalty is death. We can rationalize that, and it makes sense. It has to be that way. But he also designed a rescue mission featuring his son so that one day there will be no more pain, suffering, disease, tears. You and I aren't at that time yet. We're not in Revelation 21:4. We're not in the new heaven. We're here today where there is pain and suffering and disease. So in the 2-3 minutes I have left, I want to be very practical for you, or with you. We're still in a battle. We're not at that time yet. We're here, and we're in a battle. There's a battle going on for the souls of men, women, and children all around the world, the United States, Maine, and right here in Somerville, and right here in this church. And it's important to be prepared for the battle. That's really what this is about. I talked to you about the resources, the website, the info bites. I want, in the time that's left, I just want to highlight one more really effective tool that we have to help, and that is the Creation Magazine. In just a minute, not yet, but in just a minute, he's going to pass out the sign-up sheets again to give you an opportunity to sign up for the Creation Magazine. But I want to share a couple things about it before that gets passed out, and we're going to be in the back to help you with this. But you can subscribe for either 1 or 2 years. It comes out quarterly. Been around for about 40 years, to be honest. And it's all material. There's no advertising in it. It's article after article after article. If you sign up today, either the 1 year or the 2 year, you'll also get a digital version that you can share on up to 5 different devices. You can send them to your grandkids, you can send it to your neighbor, whichever. I know you're recording this, but I'll say it anyway. You can send it to as many people as you want. Okay, we just have to have something to share that. We just want people to get it. But in order to get that digital version, you have to sign up today. Otherwise, normally it's about $20 a year by itself. So you'll get the digital version, you'll get a monthly newsletter, as well as the magazine. So if you do it today for a 1-year subscription, you'll actually get this subscription, and you'll get the digital version. If you do the 2-year, you will also get a copy of a Darwin documentary. Basically, we retrace Darwin's steps on his voyage of the Beagle, asking the question, if he were an evolutionist, if he were alive today, would he still be an evolutionist, knowing what we know? It's very well done, very informative. And you also get a copy of that Fallout DVD so you can hear firsthand why students are walking away from their faith. So I'm subliminally pointing you to the 2-year. It's the best deal. And what I need you to do when those sign-up sheets come by, if you want to sign up for the newsletter, you've got to fill in the information and tear off the perforated edge. And after the service, or during the break, or after lunch, bring that piece of paper back to us so we can process the payment and give you the magazine and give you the DVDs. Okay? Otherwise, if you sign up and you take it with you, you just have the sign-up sheet. That's all you're going to have. So if you could pass those out now, that'd be great. And I'll just run through a couple of examples of what this magazine will give. It's really an evangelism tool, to be honest. We receive more feedback from the magazine than anything else. It is, in this case, Rebecca, 99 years old, she preaches to her family members, friends, using the magazine. It's life-changing information too. I know race is a big issue in our country right now, but Bible can explain where we all came from, where we have different shades of skin. I didn't talk about it in this talk, but dinosaurs is another one. I think someone else mentioned fossils in one of the comments. Did you know there are red blood cells found in dinosaur bones? There's been soft tissue, unfossilized material found in dinosaur bones that are thought to be 65 million years old. I didn't learn that in school. And in this case, the scientist that discovered it and was part of that research said it was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. Of course, I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, the bones are, after all, 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? She's locked into a worldview that says long periods of time, right? We know why. They're not that old. And lastly, I'll just point you to a few books at the back. Creation Answers book covers the basic questions, 60 of them. A little bit more detail in Evolution's Achilles' Heels. And I'll end with this slide. The Biblical Geology 101 is a new book that came out, and it covers a lot of what I talked about in terms of the canyon formation and the geology. So I thank you for your attention, and I hope 1 Peter 3:15, meekness and fear, gentleness and respect, rang true with how I've presented, because that was certainly the way I intended it. We may have different views, but I hope I've given you something to think about. Thank you very much, Pastor.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Benjamin. Excuse me. Appreciate that. And we all agree with you, by the way. Amen. Let's conclude by standing together and turning to hymn number 25. Hymn number 25. Now we're on? Very good. Thanks for coming back. All right. I bet you've never talked about tree ring dating ever in church. Maybe not ever, period, but maybe never in church. This talk is one that I gave at the Creation Ministries they call it a super conference every 3 years down in Myrtle Beach. They gather everybody from across the country, all the speakers, and put together a week-long conference. And so this is the one that I did for them because my background is in forestry, as my bio indicated. So we're going to look at tree ring dating from a biblical perspective. The biblical principles that we're going to use for this are the same as first thing this morning. Engage our mind as a form of worship. Asking questions, answering questions is a form of worship. And the whole process is intended to strengthen your biblical worldview. Even if you haven't asked a question like, how old are trees? The process that we're going to go through is one that I would encourage you to do with any question that's related to things that apply to the Bible. And from the very beginning of this, I think it's really important to pause and take a look at why trees are so amazing. They are an amazing creation from God, and I'm going to use a species of tree from the Northwest or from Western U.S., the sequoias. The coastal redwoods. You've probably all seen them, heard them, and they're known for their massive size.
One tree in particular has been nicknamed Hyperion, and it's about 379 feet tall. It's been estimated to be that high. But the amazing thing is, it all comes from just one little seed. So small cones in coastal redwoods, approximately about an inch long, produce small brown seeds when they're mature. These small seeds, they're so small that it takes about 125,000 of them to make 1 pound. A single tree may produce 6 million of these seeds in a given growing season. Only 5% of those actually germinate, and less than that still ever become seedlings. And obviously then fewer still would ever become the giants that we'd see on the landscape. Almost doesn't matter what species of tree you're talking about, you've got some giants in those species. Giants that dwarf the Statue of Liberty, and giants that would dwarf even a Brachiosaurus. Okay, so trees are amazing, and this all comes from, in each of these species, it all comes from a small seed. Different species, but it all starts out very small. How does it happen? Very briefly, it happens through another design marvel of God, which is photosynthesis. Trees produce their own food. They take light from the sun, water from the soil, and CO2 from the atmosphere, and turn that into energy. Now, we learned about that process in science class known as photosynthesis, but this process even occurs under extreme conditions. Trees can survive with limited water, limited nutrients, extremes in temperature, wind. They can survive in that, but they most certainly don't thrive. Right? We all know that. And trees have also been used to help us survive some pretty harsh conditions as well. Biblically speaking, the one that probably comes to mind is Noah's Ark. Noah would not have had an ark if it weren't for trees. God instructed Noah in Genesis chapter 6, verse 14, to build an ark out of gopher wood. Now, to my knowledge, that's the only time the word, or the term gopher wood was used in the Bible, and suffice it to say, we don't know what tree species he was referring to. Some have speculated cypress, some have speculated teak. For our purposes this morning, it really doesn't matter what the species was. What matters is Noah needed a lot of wood to build that ark. It was about 1.5 football fields in length, 4 stories tall, and he built it all by hand. For those of you that are probably in Maine, you're all connected to the forest industry in some way. How many burn wood for home heat? A lot. How many have hauled wood for a friend or as your father? Everybody knows how much energy it takes to use wood in this way. Well, Noah would have needed, estimates have been put forward, he needed about 3.1 million board feet of lumber to produce and build the ark. That's enough lumber for 2,000 square foot homes, for framing of those homes. If you put it into perspective on rough estimates of size of trees, so if we have a good sized tree in Maine that's 2 feet in diameter and 80 feet tall, he would have needed over 4,100 trees of that size in order to build the ark. Now, we don't know what he did, how he did it, but we know what the size of the ark was. So it was a tremendous amount of work, and they didn't have logging contractors with skidders and feller bunchers to do any of that. So it's hard to imagine Noah building the ark. It's probably even harder to imagine for you to live without trees. So try to imagine your life without trees. You wouldn't have wood for your home to heat. You wouldn't have wood for framing, for cabinets, for furniture. There'd be no packaging for all your Amazon orders that show up at your door when you're not there. Then there's the all-important non-timber products like maple syrup, or even medicinal ingredients like Taxol, which is derived from the bark of Pacific yew trees to help fight cancer. It's hard to imagine our life without trees. It's also hard to imagine the Bible without trees. And I'm not referring to the physical pages, right? I'm referring to Scripture itself. The Bible mentions more than 35 different tree species. And trees are mentioned more in the Bible than any other living thing other than God and people. So trees are an integral part of Scripture. They're an amazing part of God's creation. And so we're going to take one question about trees this morning and look at it from a biblical perspective, and that is, are the trees alive today that predate the flood? Now you might think, well, the answer is no, and then I'm going to go. There's all kinds of food in there. And you're right, the answer is no, there aren't trees alive today that predate the flood. But in order to fully understand why, we need to dig into it a little bit further. You were all here this morning to look at this biblical timeline. So we've got 6,000 years, 4,500 years, 2,000. It comes from the Bible and those chronogenealogies. Just as a quick review, we got the biblical timeline. So based on the biblical timeline, what is the maximum age that trees could have? Maximum age would be what? 4,500, because the flood destroyed everything. Biblically speaking, there was nothing left. Okay, so there's our upper limit when we're thinking and looking at this. Now, you might be completely satisfied with that answer and then run off for more coffee. I get it. But it's important to understand the other side and what you might get for an answer if you Googled this. And this is where it comes into play. If you're trying to engage with someone who doesn't believe what you believe, it is important to understand what they believe so that you can talk to them with meekness and fear, gentleness, and respect. So, the quote-unquote other side, evolutionary timeline, is in billions of years, millions of years. So what would the maximum age be for trees? I don't want you to Google this right now, but if you were to Google it, what do you think the maximum age for trees would be? Would it be in the hundreds of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions? What do you think?
I think that Roman cypress is over 1,000 years old.
So we got thousands. I heard a 10,000 somewhere. Maybe not you, but you're right. It's in this. It's in this time frame. It's not millions and tens of millions or billions of years. No one's projecting that. But if you Googled right now, oldest trees in the world, you would get answers that would be in the thousands and tens of thousands. So some of them are going to support the biblical timeline, and other ones are going to be way outside it. But we're not talking millions of years outside it. And how you reconcile those differences with the biblical timeline is really the focus of this. So I've already done the homework for you. I Googled last, April, May, whenever it was, Nikki and I were down in South Carolina, and I found what the internet says are the oldest trees. So I'm going to introduce some of them to you. This one's actually dead, but when it was alive, the senator, it was nicknamed the senator in Longwood, Florida, and it's a pond cypress, had an estimated age of 3,500 years. Okay? It was actually destroyed by a man-made fire. There was a cavity under the tree, and some people carelessly dropped a cigarette or something, and it went up. But at the time of its death, it was 3,500 years. We have a Patagonian cypress, which has a range in age. My original slide had about 3,600 years as well, but about 2 days before the presentation I gave in May, there was some new finding from scientists that put that one at closer to 5,500 years. So we have a pretty big range in time, and that one is located in a national park in Chile. It is still living. We have a Mediterranean cypress in Iran. About 4,000 to 5,000 years is the range in age that it gives. Legend has it that it was planted by either Zoroaster, an Iranian prophet, or maybe Japheth, Noah's third son. That's what legend says. We can go to Wales for a look at a common yew tree. Again, the same range in age, 4,000 to 5,000 years. Now, these are specifically the trees that I'm showing in the picture. So I'm hoping you ask, or are asking yourself the question, well, why can't they tell exactly how old it is? That's something we're going to look at, because it's important to know the dating methods that are used. The next three trees come from California, and they are Great Basin bristlecone pines. These ones persist at high elevations, extremes in temperature, very rugged, really not nice-looking trees. The first one is Methuselah, named after Noah's grandfather. It grows in the White Mountains. And it's estimated that the tree germinated around 2830 BC, which makes it even older than the Egyptian pyramids. Another Great Basin bristlecone pine was nicknamed Prometheus. They didn't know how old it was until the researcher who was trying to estimate its age accidentally cut it down. So that's a tough day at the office when you are the one that caused the oldest tree in the world at the time to be cut down. But it was given a range of, let's say 4,900 years, okay? And the last one, because that tree was accidentally cut down, this one is unnamed and its location is not shared publicly because they don't want the same thing to happen. But this tree, its estimate was given to be a little over 5,000 years old. That title of oldest tree was actually revoked in 2017 when the tree core could not be found at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. So there's even drama in the tree ring field of study too. But there we have some that are pushing that 5,000 time frame. The next three are much older than that. We've got a Norway spruce, 9,500 years old is the estimate that's given for it. We have Huon pine from Tasmania, an estimate of 10,000 years is given for that one. And lastly, we have Pando, which in Latin means I spread, which has been given an upper limit age on the internet of 80,000 years. So, I don't expect you to remember all those different names and ages. We're going to look at this slide repeatedly through this, because the goal of this is to share with you how to analyze and look at something from a biblical perspective. We start off with what does the Bible say? Okay, 4,500 years is kind of our upper limit. Well, what would we say biblically about what I found on the internet? Well, I list those trees. Right off the bat, I wouldn't have a problem with the senator because it was below the age of our upper limit. In order to analyze this, what we're really doing, I'm just going to quickly review it. I'm not going to spend much time because I went too long this morning, and we only have half an hour left. Operational science and historical science are the key things to take away when you're looking at this topic. So operational is present, observable, testable, and repeatable. Historical is not those things, okay? I also need to give you a very quick basic understanding of how trees grow in order to look at those ages and the estimates that were given. We basically have two types of trees, hardwood and softwood. Softwood, technical term is gymnosperm. Hardwood, technical term is angiosperm. It's seed. Naked seed is the gymnosperm in softwood. That's where the seeds are dispersed. The seeds come in fruit in the hardwood trees. Don't confuse those terms with the hardness of the wood, because you can have some softwood trees that are harder than some hardwood trees. That's not where they come from. So those are the two classifications, and we're mostly going to look at softwood trees. So here's a cross-section of a tree, and we'll look at the key components in order to determine how they grow. We'll start at the bark. Everybody knows what that looks like. You know what it is. Just beneath it has a protective layer called the phloem, and that's where sap is running. And in between the phloem and the part that we would call the wood, which is technically called xylem, is a very thin layer called the cambium. The cambium covers the entire tree, from the tip of the branches, the outer stem in between the phloem and the xylem, all the way down through the roots. It's a sheath. And as the tree grows, the cells that are produced either become wood or become bark. And as that happens, the whole thing expands. And it happens through cell division at the cambium layer. And that's where we're going to be focusing. And that's because, or as that happens, that's why you get to see visually tree rings. You've all seen a tree cut down and you can visually see when you look down. It's because the tree has grown out through cell division and the thing expands. That's loosely what we can what we can talk about. You've seen this. This is one that's been sanded, smoothed out, varnished, and the rings are much more visible. You can simply count them across to know how old the tree is. In our climate, temperate climates, it's basically one ring per year. But you can have more than one a year, and those are called false rings. And that's why we're looking at this, because that affects how the trees are dated in that list. But if I zoom in on this, and then I zoom in again on that grade piece, you've got about, 6 or 7 rings to go at this point. If we were to zoom in 25 to 50 times on just this one growth ring, this is what we would see. Now, it's been dyed so you can determine the cells. But what I want to highlight here is this whole piece, from here all the way in here, would be one annual ring. And there's zones in here. We've got larger cells in this area, and then if you can kind of see through here, the cells are smaller and the cell wall is thicker. That's what gives you that visible appearance of light wood, and then that really thin area of what we call dark wood. And so those sections, we have early wood, then we have late wood, and that represents one growing season. And then everything stops. The growth stops until the next growing season, until the spring. And then you have larger cells, and it just keeps repeating. That's what allows us to count rings and estimate tree age. Now, what if you can't cut the tree down? You don't want to be that guy that had the bad day at the office, right? Well, you can do things like coring into the tree. And if any of you know any foresters, ask them about tree coring. It sounds simple. There's actually a bit of an art to it as well. But basically, they core into a tree, and they're cutting out what looks like a straw-sized core that comes with it. They can cut that core in half, sand it, and then look on it to determine those rings. But you're getting a small sample, and you better hope you actually hit the center of the tree to know what that growth was like. But that's a non-destructive sampling method. Trees don't die if you core one hole into them. This is what the tree cores might look like. This is from a Scots pines. We've got bark on this side. We haven't hit the center of the tree, so we don't know how old the tree is from this. But I can tell you, because I counted them, there's 90 tree rings in this particular section. So they can be really small, and you might need a microscope in order to determine one from the other. And these have all been on softwood trees that have shown so far. Hardwood trees like oak are different again. But you still can determine a ring. You have ring porous, non-porous. We're not going to get into too much of that. What I want to share now is we're going to go back to this slide and look at what we've just learned very quickly on tree growth and determine if these dates make sense or not, whether we can trust them or not. So at the beginning, as I said, no problem with the senator age, 3,500 years, we can take that. The Patagonian cypress in Chile, it was estimated not through direct measurement, it was estimated through interpolation or extrapolation and then interpolation using some statistical methods. They didn't hit the center of the tree. And they made some assumptions in that growth. And as I said, back in May, there was a news article that came out highlighting the technique they were using. It's not the same as taking an increment core and counting 5,484 rings. They didn't do that. So I can lean on the other side and say 3,600 years still fits, but the 5,484 was not from a direct measurement. They did some interpretation. The next two have that 1,000-year range. How and why would you have such a range? Why can't you just find out how old that tree is? Well, it's because it's really difficult to do a core of these trees. The first one, the Mediterranean cypress, we're going to zoom in on the base of the tree. Just from the picture I showed, looks fine. But can you imagine trying to core into something that looks like like a bush with dozens of stems coming out of the center. The estimate was given based on written records, estimates of written records. It's not a direct measurement. And even if I took a chainsaw and I cut that down and then looked down, I'm not going to have this nice concentric circles all the way around. It's going to be very difficult to do that. You're not allowed to cut this one down, which is fine. But the age estimate only fits into the biblical timeline half the way. Well, I'm not going to argue about the part that doesn't. I can say, well, let's give this one an upper limit of 4,500 years, and it does fit, if indeed it is that. But it's not from a direct measurement. Same thing with the common yew. We're going to zoom in on this piece, and when you do, most of the tree's missing. So this was another one where the estimates were given based on legend and written records. Well, was it exactly that tree? We don't know. When I mentioned before on the tree from Chile, when I mentioned that they use extrapolation methods, one way that I could come up with an estimate is to core one of these, find out, say, an average growth rate for the piece I did, that it grew 1 inch for 50 years. And then I could say, well, then I need another 5 inches to get to the center, or I need another 60 inches to get to the center, and apply that same growth rate. That's one way that you can extrapolate and take a measurement, but it's nowhere near the same as a direct measurement. In fact, in this case, you can't do that. So again, if the estimates give it 4,000 to 5,000, I can agree with 4,500 and say, okay, maybe this was alive soon after the flood. So those kind of get a smaller check mark in my mind. Now this one, bristlecone pine, right at the limit, but much more precise numbers. These ones were measured. They actually were counted. So it adds a different level of how did they do that to this. Let's look at the assumptions for that. They were given from ring counts, but try to imagine doing a ring count on a tree that looks like this or from a stump like this. These trees grow in very harsh conditions, and they don't grow the same way that a white pine in Maine is going to grow. If you typed bristlecone pine at creation.com, you'd get probably 10 to 12 different articles that have already been written on it. And I'm just going to grab one from the Journal of Creation to highlight and give you a reason as to why you can subtract, say, 500-600 years from that upper limit, because they did count rings, and they were 4,800, 5,100 years. How do we take some off to still fit the biblical timeline? The evidence for this, the reason for this, is multiple growth rings a year. It's called multiplicity. And this author, Mark Matthews, cited a study that was done in the early 80s where someone intentionally caused drought conditions for bristlecone pine and was able to incite or cause multiple growth rings in a given year through drought conditions. So that's operational science. He showed that could be done. Now we can apply that knowledge to something we're looking back in time for. So do these trees grow in drought conditions? Yes, they certainly do. So it's plausible that some of those extra years that didn't fit the timeline were because of that. In fact, Matthews describes the growing conditions of bristlecone pines: short, cool summers, growing season thought only to be several weeks long, desert-like aridity, and many trees grew out of little more than cracks in rocks. Okay? Further, the thing that was weird is that the long ages for bristlecone pines only came from the sites where they were really poor growing conditions. When they were growing on sites that were much better, they had much younger ages. So if you take a stand of trees, a group that are growing in the same area, the ones that were on the outside edge that had more drought conditions, that were certainly poorer conditions, had higher ages than the ones that were growing in the best sites, which lends more emphasis and focus on, well, when you have really bad conditions, you probably are going to have those multiple rings in a given year. So, and here's an example of that. This particular study shows that false rings, sometimes they're only 2 or 3 cells in thickness, shows the evidence of those, and that's really hard to determine if you're just coring into a particular tree. So the bottom line is that for bristlecone pines, it may be difficult to determine if that ring is false, but you can't assume it isn't either, okay? And that adds additional doubt on the situation. I did some other reading in preparation for this talk and the work for CMI from just a secular tree study or tree age book. This one was called The Tree Story. And if you Googled it, you might find a description of something called a master chronology for a tree. And this is where individual trees may not be dated for 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 years, but what the dendrochronologists, those who study tree rings, do is figure out, well, this one is this old, and then they match growing patterns to another sample they find, and it fits here, and then the overlap is on this side, and they just keep building it, but it's not the same thing by any stretch as measuring one tree that is that long. And there's a lot of problems with assumptions you would have to make in order to match growing patterns from a known location to samples that you grab from something else. And it's not something that I can go into in any detail here, but I would like you to be aware of that is something that you might read, and it's very different than measuring tree rings on a single tree. I'm going to skip these two and go right here. So I don't have a problem subtracting, say, 10% of the growth rings from those previous limits to say, look, once every 10 years in those growing conditions, is it possible that once every 10 years you might have 1 year with multiple rings? Yeah, to me that's possible. And it only has to happen 1 in 10 years for me to lose 500 years off a 5,000-year-old ring count, because they actually did count those rings. So it lends some credibility to that. Now the next three are vastly different, right? 9,500 years, 10,000, 80,000. These are very easily explained because their methods are not actually measuring tree rings. They're making some pretty significant assumptions. The first one, Norway spruce, it was estimated by carbon dating the root system. It wasn't measured, wasn't given by measuring the age of the tree. They used carbon dating for the roots. I do not have time, although chapter 4 of the Red Book on the table, the entire chapter talks about the issues associated with carbon dating. But that's how they were doing it here. And creation.com, there's several different articles on this. The main point to remember is that it was not the case of an individual tree measuring to 9,500 years. The living stem of that particular tree was only a few hundred years old. But that tree continued by suckering, so the layering. The branches would go down and be buried, and then they would pop up, and one branch would become the next tree that was living in that spot. Each individual stem was only a few hundred years old by actually measuring it. So there's a lot of assumptions that those that want to project a long age to what we see, those are the assumptions that they're putting in there. This book, as I said, chapter 4, has a lot of more information on carbon dating. The Huon pine tree, same thing, okay? Carbon-14 was the dating method used for the clones. Living tree samples by increment bore only yielded ages up to about 2,500 years. And in those cases, they didn't hit the center of the tree, so they started extrapolating. And carbon-14 was used for dating the tree based on clone pollen from a local lake. So it wasn't even the sample from a given tree. And as I said, there's all kinds of issues associated with carbon-14 dating as well, even though C14, carbon-14 dating, is a friend of creationists because it puts an upper limit, not millions, but you can't have detectable carbon in a sample, according to the current assumptions, about 80,000 up to maybe 100,000 years. So if there's carbon-14 in a dinosaur fossil, it can't be 65 million years old. It's got to be in the thousands, not the millions. But that's an aside for this one. The one I really wanted to highlight is the 80,000 year. Okay, Pando, quaking aspen. How was this age determined? Even though it's readily visible online, it's 80,000 years. If you dig further and take the time to read some of the reference articles, the researchers admit they don't know how old it is. They admit we're speculating, but you have to dig and read in order to find it out. If you just hit the highlights, it says oldest living organism in the world, 80,000 years, and then you keep on going. Could be your kids doing a science project at school. They want to know the oldest organism. Well, they grab that, they reference it properly, but if you don't really read and dig into what the assumptions are, you're going to get, you're going to make a wrong assumption yourself. Here's what one of the articles said that I read. It said, estimates have been made for this particular organism, and it's not even one tree. This is a clonal colony. Hundreds to thousands of years. No good method currently exists to place an accurate age on the lifespan of Pando. So they're calling this whole complex, acres and acres of land, they're calling that one tree that's 80,000 years. It's not one tree, and it's that area. So I'm guessing that maybe they measured at some point the rate of spread of that colony and then projected that back in time. That's a possibility, but it most definitely isn't measuring the age of a tree, and they themselves even say, we don't really know. We are guessing. Now, I'm fine with that. At least they said it, but the problem I have is if you just Google something, you're going to get just the headlines that point you in the wrong direction, okay? So for these last three, I just scratch them off. I say they're not that old, and I would put them even younger than the 4,500. I discount it in this kind of a discussion. So, are there trees alive today that predate the flood? No, there are not. And there's legitimate reasons to take those older ages and shrink them back to, at the very upper limit, the 4,500 years, but probably they're even younger than that. I've been watching the time, so you yourself might not have asked the question, how old can a tree be? I understand that. But I hope what and maybe you have, and we can talk more at lunch, but I hope what you've grabbed from this half hour, 40 minutes is you can take a question where a worldly answer will easily contradict what the Bible says. And you can then spend some time looking for some answers. So even on the creation.com, if you had asked that question and typed it in, you would have found the articles on bristlecone pine. You wouldn't have found the other stuff. I had to dig more to fill an hour talk down in South Carolina. But you would have found some legitimate answers as to why that wasn't true. And you can do this for anything. So anything you hear, whether it's in something from the Hubble Space Telescope, something down into microbiology, genetics, don't settle for a lame answer. Do some digging, ask questions, and seek answers, because that is a form of worship, especially when it lends yourself and points you toward God and toward, I'll put in quotation marks, the right answer, because it is the right answer. That's all I have on the talk for this one. I'll be around for lunch if you guys have more questions. I'm sure it's the only time you've discussed tree ring dating in Sunday school, but I appreciate the time and the attention, and as I said, we'll be hanging around for a little while after too. So thank you very much.